Wonderful presentation by Erin and Taniqua. Taniqua is not with us today. However, Erin will be joined by Roger Maldonado, who is an attorney. He's on his way from Dobbs Ferry, so Erin may have to speak a little slowly. Last week we heard the shocking news about what housing is like in the Hartford area and in Connecticut. And this week we're going to hear what OCA is hoping to do about that and how we can help. Thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to Erin.
All right, we're trying this mic. Does that work? All right, very good. So how many people, I'm recognizing some faces from last week. So I think we had, I know a lot of people return, and then I also think, I'm hoping that indicates that people who are joining us virtually also were here last week, so I don't have to go too much, backtracking over what we talked about last time. But I will do a super fast version of that. OCA, we're focused on addressing segregation in Connecticut. We've been around for about 8 years. Part of the place setting for this is that Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the country, that we're one of the most expensive states in the country when it comes to housing, that these things combined, plus the whole history of segregating policies has resulted in real disparities in access to opportunity that are also connected to race. So these are opportunity maps. The lightly shaded areas are places that are what we call lower opportunity, but those are places that need investments. The dark orange areas are places that are resource rich and often have not created opportunities for lower income families in particular who are disproportionately Black and Latino to join us. I said join us because Roger joined us. Welcome, Roger. Barriers to having lower income families who are disproportionately Black and Latino move into communities that have been off limits. So this is the map of where we see families of color living in Connecticut. So a real correlation with those lower opportunity areas. And these factors connected to other discriminatory and segregating policies have led to a real disparity in income and wealth. Black and Latino families are earning half or less of what white families are earning in Connecticut and have about 1/10 or less of the wealth. Obviously, this is on average. This is just statistically speaking. So this has meant that affordable housing really is part of the puzzle and the part of the solution when we think about how to address segregation. So on this map, or on this chart, this is our effort to try to help people understand the notion of affordable housing. I mean, what does that mean? There are a lot of definitions out there. There are definitions in state law, there are definitions in federal programs, there are definitions, even different definitions within state programs. And so it's hard to take anything that is out there sort of as a law and say this is what it means to have affordable housing. So instead, we look at what the need is based on a couple of different factors. The definition that you often hear, which I think is pretty helpful, is this notion that no one should be paying more than 1/3 of their income towards their housing costs. And so on this chart, that middle column that says cost burdened, those are families in Connecticut paying more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. Now, I'm not so worried about a millionaire that is paying more than 1/3 of their income towards their housing costs. Like, that just seems like maybe some bad choices are being made. So I'm not so worried about all of the 474,000 families. We start breaking that down by income level. So that 80% AMI over on the left, that AMI means area median income. Loosely speaking, that's about $80,000 a year for a family of 4. And if you keep moving down, 50% AMI, that's about $50,000 a year. 30% AMI, that's about $30,000 a year for a family of 4. So there are 214,000 families in the state of Connecticut who are 30% of area median income. So then we take that across, this is the most conservative definition that we could come up with of housing burden, what the need for affordable housing. So if you look at the families paying 30% of their income or more, of those very low income families, it's $167,000. If you take it even further and look at families who are paying 50% of their income or more, it's 135,000 families. So these are families earning around $30,000 a year for a family of 4 and paying more than half of that income towards their housing costs. So they only have $15,000 a year to live on. So then we connect this to race and ethnicity. So of the 214,000 families who are earning 30% of area median income or less, that represents 10% of the white non-Hispanic population in the state, represents 26% of the black non-Hispanic population, 21% of people who on the census indicate that they categorize themselves as other race, non-Hispanic, and then 30% Hispanic of any race. So you can see that you're twice or 3 times as likely to be in this situation where you have a very low income if you are not white. So that's, I think that's the connection we often need to make, and often when people are thinking about affordable housing and we say this is an issue of race, they get their backs up because it's like, no, we just don't want poor people here, which also has its own conversation. But this is how it connects. So even, let's say for a moment, there's not intent to segregate, the impact of not having affordable housing in any given place is that you will be less likely to have diversity and be reinforcing lines of segregation. So we're gonna move into thinking about solutions. And there's so many solutions out there, so we don't want to overwhelm you, but we also want to just sort of give you a taste of what the options are. And we really want to focus on how the government can play a role in this. We know from what Taniqua told us last week that the government played an instrumental role in intentionally getting us to where we are. So there's a very important role for the government, and this is even according to the law under the Fair Housing Act, to help us get out of this. And the way we break it down with our sort of background in housing is we look at where is the government actually investing its own money in creating housing. This is called subsidized housing. Where is it helping families seek housing on their own and helping to pay for it through vouchers? Those are called housing vouchers. We'll talk more about that. How do land use policies affect all of this, planning and zoning? I'm going to try to move pretty quickly through those first 2 and then turn it over to Roger to really focus on zoning, because that affects everything else. And then how does, are governments actually in any way trying to set goals and measure results? I mean, if you want to tackle a problem, you need some goals and you need to see how you're doing and you need to adjust and then continue working on it, right? And then another important part of this that we're not going to touch on today is the government making equitable investments in places that for years and decades and lifetimes been disinvested from? That's very important. It's not what we're going to touch on today. We'd be happy to talk about that more, but it's part of the puzzle. And then there are all kinds of private things that we need to be looking at. Is housing discrimination going on in the rental market, in the home sales market, in the mortgage lending market? Those are all important. And then both private individuals and governments can be thinking hard about whether any given community, and particularly communities that have been off limits to lower income, disproportionately Black and Latino families, are they creating a sense of welcome? Are they looking at their structures and systems to make sure that they're creating a welcoming place if families do want to move there? And not every family does. So when we think about these physical units of affordable housing, you saw this map last week. Upshot is, most of the housing that has been built by the government, paid for by the government, most subsidized housing is located in those low and very low opportunity areas. Only 13% is located in those high and very high opportunity areas that represent almost 60% of the state, and it's where 40% of the people live. So we can solve this. We can totally deal with this. And the steps that I would recommend are, again, having those measurements. How are we doing? Have some goals, have some measurements. Actually have some requirements to balance where subsidized housing is going all across the state. Part of that comes back to zoning. So addressing exclusionary zoning is really a big, big part of this. And then, you know, if towns are really not playing a role, sort of helping the state as a whole, consider doing some overrides of local zoning. And we have a whole additional approach that we'll talk about in more depth about how to address zoning. But very specifically with regard to subsidized housing, that might be a solution that we think hard about. With tenant-based subsidies, these are subsidies that the government gives out to families who income qualify, but not everyone. It's a lottery. You get on a list. Only 1 in 4 or 5 families that income qualifies for housing vouchers actually gets them. Huge problem, although some of the funding from DC that's coming down the line should expand the number of vouchers that we have here in Connecticut. These vouchers, to participate with them, a family is expected to pay 1/3 of their income towards housing costs, and then the voucher covers the rest, but only up until a cap. And so that cap can become a problem, and I'll sort of talk about how that works. The way these programs work, because of all kinds of barriers, and I'll touch on some of them, is that rather than being what the federal program is called is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, like it's supposed to create choice, that part seems to be missing because the choice part really is not happening, and only 7% of voucher holders through the state-funded program are living in those high and very high opportunity areas. And there are many, many, many families who want that option, probably around half of voucher families. So lots of voucher families have not opted for that, have not expressed an interest in those kinds of moves, and we can talk about some of the details there, but there are lots of families who have, and they haven't had the opportunity really to move out. So the issues, those caps on the value of the vouchers are hugely problematic because the program assumes that the rents are the same within entire regions. So a 2-bedroom in Simsbury is deemed by the program to cost the same as a 2-bedroom in Hartford or a 2-bedroom in Glastonbury. So that has been a huge, huge problem, and as we've worked with clients who are trying to make these moves, it's been almost impossible in some instances, although we know the housing is there. Big issue. 80% of the vouchers are actually controlled by local housing authorities, and these housing authorities actually face penalties if families working with them leave their jurisdiction. So, and most of those housing authorities most of the vouchers held by the housing authorities are in big cities. So just a structural problem with the program. Housing discrimination, rampant with the vouchers. It's called source of income discrimination. We need more affordable units, which we've talked about. And then there's not full information shared with voucher recipients about housing that's actually available. There's something called racial blind spotting that academic named Maria Kreisen, it's a notion she came up with, but it's this idea that all of us, when we're looking at housing, we are thinking, because our worlds are so much reflective of our own race, we are only thinking of neighborhoods that also reflect our own race. And so this idea of seeking housing anywhere except for places we know well is very unlikely unless you're somehow introduced to that in a more structured way. So we know how to deal with this. There are all kinds of solutions out there. We can correct the cap. We actually brought a lawsuit against the Trump administration in 2018, and we won it. That took a big step forward on that by calculating those voucher values at a more micro level in 25 areas across the country, including the Hartford region. Didn't go far enough. There's more that needs to happen. We need to get this going all across the country. It's called small area fair market rents for anyone who wants the technical language. But this can be done, it's working where it's in place, but it needs to go even further and better assess what the local market rent is. Expand the jurisdiction of housing authorities. Again, we have actually brought a complaint against the state of Connecticut, administrative complaint before HUD, basically saying the way we do these housing authority restrictions is violating the Fair Housing Act. So, you know, that's pending, we'll see what happens, but that's, I think, a really important part of addressing this. And then we're doing testing for housing discrimination, and so are other groups like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. Addressing exclusionary zoning, we'll talk about. And then we need to fully fund something called mobility counseling. This is a counseling intervention where families on vouchers work one-on-one with a counselor, explore their interests in choosing a home, what's a priority for them, do they need to be near transportation, are they thinking about school performance, you know, all of these things, and then a counselor actually helps them make moves and connect to landlords. And this is something that is actually happening in many places across the country. It's happening in Seattle, in Dallas, in Chicago, in Baltimore. This is Baltimore. The sort of box there is Baltimore Central. A lawsuit was brought when families were moving from public housing that was being torn down. This is where they moved immediately after that move. The ACLU down there said, you guys, there's going to be a problem, because we know what's going to happen. You're just going to reinforce lines of segregation unless you offer choices to families. They brought a big lawsuit, and then they got mobility counseling instituted. And once that happened, this is where families moved. And once families moved, they stayed. 82% of families after a certain period, after 2 years, you know, do you want to stay where you are? 82% said absolutely, and reported more positive mental health outcomes, lower asthma rates, improved school performance for kids, improved employment performance for parents, and higher likelihood of going back to school. So lots of positive outcomes when the moves happen. And then I think the last thing I'll say, just in terms of non-zoning solutions, is you've seen, just from what I've shown you in the last couple of minutes, how critical the data is. I mean, data, you can just sort of think data and go to sleep, but unless we have the information to show what's happening and even keeping track of how we might be improving going forward or not improving, we can never address this. And so far, the state of Connecticut has not been on housing collecting and sharing data in a way that helps us measure what's going on. So this is really important to how we address this issue. Okay, so we are joined also today by Roger Maldonado, and OCA is incredibly grateful to have Roger on board. He's been on board with us since March, and came to us from a sort of sister housing organization in New York, where he did a lot of this work after graduating from Yale Law School and Yale undergrad. And Roger, I will let you take it away and also share any other introductory remarks. And I'm going to turn this off here.
Can you all hear me? Great, great. Well, thank you so much. I apologize for being a little bit late. I ended up parking in the wrong congregation's parking lot, so I'm hoping for the charitable spirit to be with them. It's such an honor to be here and a pleasure in this beautiful venue. My name's Roger Maldonado. I'm a staff attorney with Open Communities Alliance, and I've been doing fair housing work since I graduated from law school, as Erin mentioned. I'm going to talk to you today in particular about an undertaking we took in June of this year, our Zoning for Equity report, that really dug in depth into a lot of these issues that we see in our high opportunity but unfortunately racially segregated communities. But before that, I'm going to do a really quick little background discussion for you all on planning and zoning. This is probably 101 level, so I'll move it very quickly through it. Planning is basically the philosophy that undergirds zoning. It's, you know, the goals that you have for land use and development in your community over a 10-year period. Zoning, on the other hand, is the nitty-gritty. You know, that's where you can build, what you can build there, how much you can build there, and it actually gets into some non-physical considerations as well, such as which tenants are eligible for those buildings that you create. Connecticut, part of why exclusionary zoning in Connecticut is so frustrating is that we actually have really strong laws on the books that are meant to address these issues and prevent them from manifesting in the first place. The Zoning Enabling Act in Connecticut, Statute 8-2, requires that zoning regulations provide opportunities for multifamily housing with an eye not just looking inwardly, but to the entire region, taking account of regional need, and also provide opportunities for lower income housing, moderate income housing. So it really is looking to push beyond the boundaries and, you know, help people come in and create integrated communities. That's recently been reinforced with some new language added about affirmatively furthering the purposes of the Fair Housing Act, which I'll get to in a second. And it's worth noting that there's similar language as to planning with regards to our plans of conservation of development, or POCDs. So speaking of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which, as many of you are aware, was adopted shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Supreme Court in 2015 made explicit that exclusionary zoning is really at the heartland of the purposes in that act. And you have a quote from the court's decision up on the screen. But the Supreme Court's not alone. The Supreme Court of our own state, back in 1988, made clear that we need to really critically assess zoning provisions to make sure that they're not being marshaled in a way that intentionally discriminates in ways that may promote economic segregation. And the Second Circuit, which is one below the Supreme Court with jurisdiction here in Connecticut, has recently struck down a zoning provision as both intentionally discriminatory and having the effect of keeping out Black and Latino families from a wealthy suburb in Long Island. So zoning is a core civil rights issue, and yet it's a persistent problem, and that's part of why OCA really wanted to dig into depth and find out what's happening in our communities. What are the impediments that we're seeing? And that's so critical to being able to craft the solutions, is actually knowing what the problem is. So we took a really in-depth look at 12 communities in Connecticut across our 3 largest counties, Hartford, Fairfield, and New Haven, to really study their planning and zoning top to bottom. These towns were all illustrative, and, well, what do we mean by that? Unfortunately, these are all deeply racially segregated places. Specifically, these are places with disproportionately high white populations and a serious lack of Black and Latino families. This is true if you look at them in a vacuum, or if you were to compare them to their surrounding counties, regions, or the state. Southington here in Hartford County is a powerful example of that, because it's ringed by several cities that is very close to us here in Hartford, and yet you can see the numbers, just how out of sync it is with all of those communities. In addition to being racially segregated, these were all places that are economically segregated, and specifically they are disproportionately wealthy with an absence of lower income families. So they have a lot of amenities, a lot of opportunity, but they lack both lower income families of any race and specifically Black and Latino families in particular. You have some impressive stats just showing the scope of that, including even in our state's wealthiest county, Fairfield County. These were truly towns that are above and beyond the degree of wealth. Last but certainly not least, these towns all lack affordable housing. For most of these towns, this is just readily apparent. Many of you may be familiar with the statute Erin alluded to, Section 8-30G, which is essentially for towns that have less than a certain type of affordable housing, a way for developers to more easily get approval for affordable housing proposals. 7 of our 12 towns have less than 4% of their housing that qualifies as affordable under that provision, when the threshold the provision targets is 10%. And some of these towns, like Ridgefield, don't even pretend. They say there's no way we're ever going to get there. But even for the towns that seem to have more under this provision, there is a massive, massive need. And it's an especially pronounced need when you look at housing that is accessible to the households that are perhaps of greatest concern, our lowest income households and households with children. Erin and Taniqua have spoken about how critical integration is and moving to opportunity is for children at a young age. So blocking these families is a major concern. And you can see in Berlin just how striking the number is when you really zero in on that population. You go from seemingly a 9.3% supply to 1.8% of the housing only being accessible to our lowest income families who can't afford even subsidized home ownership and who are non-elderly with children. So the goals of this report, as I've sort of started to allude to already, were to illustrate a lot of these impediments so we can help to craft solutions in an informed way. They were to show that among the existing solutions that have been put into place, there are unfortunately a lot of shortcomings. You know, either they don't go far enough in terms of the amount of the housing that can be built, or what can be built is not likely to further integration. And critically, it was meant to show that you really need a holistic view. All of these policies reinforce one another. You can't just look at one thing in isolation and worry about that because you have 12 other policies that build upon it and move in that same direction. So that's a sort of a really key piece of the work. And last but certainly not least, we wanted this report to empower local advocates and local officials to make informed changes, craft these solutions. Because while Erin has already spoken about and is going to be speaking more about some specific policy recommendations that we at OCA have, and a general framework around zoning, which Erin is going to talk about a lot after I'm done, we think it is really important that while we can provide guidelines and goals and things like that for towns, that the specifics of what should be in this zone or where should this housing be going, that's something that does take a local focus. So we're building upon local control while at the same time providing critical guidance to make sure that what happens is inclusive and does promote integration. So I'm going to go in a moment into some of the key findings in our report, but I just wanted to underscore really quickly an overarching point before I do that, which is that, as I've mentioned, this illustrated planning and zoning impediments. Zoning for equity was not, you can't read that and say, okay, I now know every single thing that is being done in Connecticut to keep out affordable and multifamily housing. That would be a much longer report. That again speaks to the need for this holistic approach to avoid what we sort of cheekily refer to as a game of zoning whack-a-mole, where if you try to knock out one problem, there's all these others that are still there or ones that can still arise. So you really do need to come at this all at once in a sort of comprehensive way. So our report's introduction section, which if you haven't had a chance to see the Zoning for Equity report, one of my earlier slides had a link to it. I would really encourage you to at least take a look at the introduction, which lays out sort of 8 recurring lessons and this wonderful Zoning 101 piece for those who'd like a little more edification on the subject matter. But these are those 8 sort of recurring themes that we saw time and again. I'm not going to take all of your morning and the beginning of your afternoon by going through all 8. I'm going to focus on 3 core ones that are highlighted here, but some of these others will be weaved into the mix. So the first thing I'd really like to talk about is that, in general, our towns make it much, much harder to develop multifamily and affordable housing than they do single-family housing. Almost invariably, if you want to build anything above certainly 2 or 3 family, but oftentimes even just 2 or 3 family housing, you need to obtain what's called a special permit or a special exception, or apply to actually change the text of the zoning code itself. This invariably requires voluminous amounts of work in terms of a very detailed application, requiring experts that can be quite expensive to do all sorts of analyses, and that application is then subjected to a very challenging and rigorous review. And last but certainly not least, it also involves public hearings, which I'll talk about in more depth, but I think we all know and probably have seen that these can be quite contentious and in of themselves can be obstacles to the development of affordable and multifamily housing. I have up on the map, on the screen, a map of the town of Fairfield, and it's not crystal clear, but I hope you can see that there are 3 little blue circles on the map. Those are the 3 only places in town where if you want to build even a 3-family development, you can do so without having to subject yourselves to those rigorous procedures, to that public hearing process. And those 3 blue circles are actually over-inclusive. If I tried to draw it more specifically, I promise you couldn't see it. So in the vast majority of town, the only way it can get done is after this incredibly difficult process, whereas single-family housing is basically allowed everywhere throughout town as of right, no problem. Even very, some of the single-family housing, it's pretty big. And just to flag part of why this is so challenging in the zoning regulations for Fairfield, if you're going for one of those zone changes that I was referencing, the town, you already have a long list of things that you need to do, and that's just the beginning. The town can ask for anything else that they deem relevant to their consideration. And if you're going for a special permit, you can be denied for things such as the housing does not harmonize, or it doesn't enhance the beauty of Fairfield. I've been doing housing work for a little while. I can honestly say I don't know how to predict what will be harmonizing or what will be beautiful. It's very subjective, it's very discretionary, and it leads to a lot of risk. Part of what makes this such a thorny problem is that towns know that these public hearing procedures cause major, major opposition to be stirred up, and which can either, outright kill a proposal. Zoning commissioners are, these are their neighbors coming out and telling them they don't want this here. Or it can disincentivize developers from even getting involved in this process in the first place. They have to be coming back to these towns again and again. The last thing I want to say on this procedural point is an example, the town of Southbury, because it really kind of shows, actually, the impact of procedure on housing development. Southbury is on both sides of the equation. For 2-family housing, you can build that as of right basically anywhere in town. For everything else, there's not 1 square inch of town where you can build it without going through all those procedures we just talked about. Lo and behold, 2-family housing in Southbury, as you can see in the top line of that second bubble, actually outperforms the state of Connecticut. There's a pretty good supply of it. Everything else underperforms both the county and the state, and often substantially performs the county of the state. All the other stuff where you need to go through these procedures. And just for even more concerningly, when you look at that top bubble, there's almost no affordable housing in Southbury. That's because all this other stuff, which is the 3+ units, those are more likely to be affordable. I'm going to get to in a second, sort of talking about why. But economies of scale being what they are, you can reach deeper the more you can do. But also that even for the 2-family, they still have these massive lot sizes that are actually augmented beyond the underlying lot sizes to 1.7 times the requirements. So, as I was just alluding to, density is the next big thing I want to talk about. Density is truly a cornerstone of affordability in housing. The more you can build in a certain area or in a certain building, the lower the cost of each of those units, generally speaking, but also, the less subsidy that you're going to need from either the government or the developer themselves to help drive down the cost. Despite the fact that density is so important, well, actually, I should say that's the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. There are also many forms of density. I think a lot of people think about density in terms of like towers, but you have these wonderful images on the right of all of these other forms of multifamily housing that can really, fit seamlessly into a neighborhood. Perhaps not some of the paint choices. I can agree that those are sometimes a little extreme in these photos. But other than that, the structures themselves can really feel like a part of the neighborhood. And critically, they can be done even off of public water and public sewer supplies. Doesn't just have to be, in a certain area, often a small area of town where that's available. Notwithstanding how important density is, notwithstanding the fact that you can really do it in a lot of ways that can fit in and complement and strengthen your communities, and notwithstanding that you don't have to do it on water and sewer, it is really strictly policed across the board in Connecticut. There are 3 key ways I want to focus on that for now. The first is that multifamily housing is often subjected to essentially single-family levels of density. The image you have on the right is that's a detached single-family neighborhood with trees and all of that, and that's 5.3 units per acre. Keep that number in mind because we're going to get back to it in a second. The average across the country is 3.2. Towns also, when they do allow for density, tend to favor certain types of housing that's inaccessible to that critical population we've already talked about. Families with children who perhaps cannot afford even subsidized homeownership opportunities. And last but not least, this is not just a zoning problem. Towns in their planning often inaccurately identify what actually is dense. So an example always helps, and Glastonbury, right by here, is a perfect example of all of these considerations. And it's Erin's hometown, so, you know, we feel okay talking about it. Of course. So in Glastonbury, the only way that you can build anything, any form of multifamily housing in the vast majority of town, it's maybe not so clear, and I apologize for that on the map, but all of the white space that you see, that sort of orangish that you see in the middle, the blue at the bottom, and there's a bit of yellow at the top, all of that is where the areas we're talking about, and the green is off limits for any development. So we really are basically talking about all of Glastonbury. The only way to build multifamily housing caps multifamily housing at 0.5 to 3 units per acre. You just heard the numbers I said before. That's below average for the country. And in terms of 0.5, that's 2-acre zoning for multifamily housing. I mean, it's just totally out of line with doing anything other than single family. But and again, the second lesson, which is that there are other uses that are favored that don't allow for family housing as easily. In Glastonbury, if you're doing home ownership as opposed to affordable rental housing, then you can do slightly more, 6 units per acre, still pretty close to that 5.3 number I mentioned, but slightly more, and that's for people and for families that can't afford home ownership, that's off the table. And then for elderly housing, you can go up to 11 units per acre. So now families are totally out of the equation. That's the only way you get that most robust set of density. Last but not least, again, the POCD for Glastonbury defines as middle density single-family housing on a minimum of a 1-acre lot. That 1-acre single-family zoning is large lot single-family zoning. That is not anywhere on the dense scale. Really quickly, the last point on density is that while I've been talking a lot about units per acre, because that's the most common way of measuring it, towns in Connecticut have myriad ways of policing density, and they often overlap one another. I'll just take a moment to flag the example from North Haven, where you have their inclusionary zoning, one of their inclusionary zoning provisions says that throughout the zone, we can't go more than 150 units. And given that 10% of that housing is supposed to be affordable, this provision that's meant to be promoting affordability ostensibly is capped out at basically 15 units. That's not a lot. So, and the last thing I just want to touch upon is the way that infrastructure, particularly water and sewer infrastructure, is often used to, is weaponized really against multifamily and affordable housing development. This is true notwithstanding the fact that modern well and septic technology really does allow for multifamily development, you know, at least up to a certain scale, off of water and sewer. And yet, time and again, we see towns saying, if you're going to do multifamily, you need to be on public water and sewer infrastructure. Ridgefield is just such a powerful example of this. In the map on the left, in the blue, is where they have sewers right now. There's a little corner in the southeast, which is yellow, where they are thinking about adding more. The map on the right shows you with the blue dotted lines where Ridgefield is planning on targeting affordable and multifamily housing. It is a 1-to-1 overlap in terms of where there is the infrastructure and where they are willing to target housing. And it's an overlap which leaves out the vast majority of the town of Ridgefield. Part of why this is so concerning, and as we can see really clearly in orange, is that towns are committed to maintaining that limited amount of water and sewer infrastructure. So in orange, their POCD states that practically all residential areas are on septic, and yet it is the long-term goal of the town to ensure that that remains the case. All the while that they require, almost all their multifamily provisions require connection to water and sewer to develop. This sort of speaks to the last piece I want to say on this subject, which is that the weaponizing of water and sewer infrastructure against the development of multifamily housing is part and parcel of a broader planning and zoning problem to really isolate multifamily housing to small areas of towns, usually as far apart as possible from the single-family, established single-family neighborhoods in towns. By the way, the lesson numbers I have here are referring back to that slide that had 1 through 8. So this is speaking to two of those other core concepts. I want to flag this from Darien because it's just so shocking. The chair of their Planning and Zoning Commission in 2008 referred to multifamily housing as, quote, a virus that threatened to, spread throughout the community. And unfortunately, this is not some, one-off that was said in 2008 and the attitude disappeared. In the 2016 POCD, the town said that they want to maintain the character of Darien as a lower density single-family neighborhood area. That's what it's going to be into perpetuity. So I will close now, and thank you for bearing with me. I hope I didn't run a little too long by just underscoring two other core overarching points. As I've already said, so far for decades in Connecticut, every knob has been turned in the direction against multifamily and affordable housing, against things that would promote integrative communities that reflect the diversity that spread across our state. And we really now need to do everything to flip the tables and move in a comprehensive way to be welcoming people into our communities. And lastly, Zoning for Equity, again, it identified all of these issues so that we can come up with informed strategies, but OCA really is looking to have local advocates and local governmental entities craft these solutions with that knowledge base that we've given them and pursuant to the framework and guidelines that Erin will be touching upon next. Thank you very much. Yeah. Oop, that's my...
So I'm hurrying along here.
If I can get this out. Problem with my pockets, I apologize. There we go.
All right, can you hear me? All right, good. All right, so we're going to move quickly to what the heck we should do about all this. So focusing particularly on zoning, we've spent the last few years really digging into what's working elsewhere in the country and formulating the sort of underlying data that we need to address this. And what we've come up with is something called fair share planning and zoning. What it does is it takes that assessment of how much housing we need, it divides it up into regions. So we know that Windham County is not the same as Fairfield. We need to sort of adjust because those places are different. Then takes the number, divides that into town allocations that are based on what towns have already done on affordable housing and the poverty rates in towns, but balanced out against how wealthy the towns are and what their median income is. And then with those numbers, each town will have 10 years to sort of put the pieces in place to, I guess I should say, to plan and zone so that over 10 years, they actually can lead to the number of units that they have been assigned. And so, then that will be followed and onto with some real enforcement. So we know this doesn't work in a vacuum. We know, just like as we drive on our roads, we need to have both stoplights and stop signs and yield signs. We also need to have, in some cases, traffic cops doing their job and enforcing the law. We need them to be doing it well. This is something we have spent a lot of time looking at it, and the trick with this is it's working already in New Jersey, where it's been in place for a number of years. And all of the tools that you might hear bandied about as a way to address exclusionary zoning, you've probably may have heard about something called missing middle, which are these like small scale 2, 4, 6 unit multifamily housing, missing middle. That can be part of the solution. Transit-oriented development, that can feed into fair share. This inclusionary zoning, where a percentage of the units are reserved as affordable and the rest of the development is market rate, that can be a way that a town chooses to reach their goal. All of this is at the town's discretion as long as they're actually trying to reach the goal and producing units. Accessory dwelling units, you've heard about those as well. So those are the in-law apartments. All of these things can work to reach the goal. And in New Jersey, where they're on the road to creating something around 300,000 units of market rate and inclusionary and affordable housing, about a third of them, of those units, have been created through inclusionary zoning. About 60% have been created with some help from the government. And if we did this in Connecticut in the same way, we would be on the road over 10 years to creating about 300,000 units also of affordable housing. And what that would do would be not only create the housing we need, do it in a way that promotes integration, but it also would be a real kick in the pants for our economy. We know that residents would be earning about $59 billion over that 10 years. There would be state and local tax revenue of about $12 billion and about 79,000 jobs created. So, this is really quite, it's a impressive thing if we can do it, but it's also going to be really meaningful to all kinds of people and the state as a whole. So, action steps. We put these, and this is the last slide, we put these both in terms of faith communities and things that can happen in your own town, but we're about to launch something called the Fair Share Consortium, which is going to be groups of organizations, faith communities all across the state that are going to be advocating both for this notion of fair share, but also for a set of investments in disinvested communities, because we believe these things need to go side by side. Greater Hartford Interfaith Advocacy Alliance, you have probably heard of. That's another organization that's doing really good work on this and might be something to consider. We would love to partner with Episcopal congregations all across the state. So we've been in some conversations with the diocese around this. It was something that Bishop Douglas has been very interested in. I know he's retiring, so we'd love to carry on that interest and think about how Episcopal congregations can be involved. And then we'd also love to partner with faith groups, of all kinds of faiths all around the state. So those are sort of the faith-based part. And then in your own community, we have something we call a town ambassador program. These are leaders within communities, particularly in towns that don't have a lot of affordable housing, who are willing to step up, be ambassadors to their community to talk about these issues and really lead change both in terms of what their local zoning ordinances look like and also possibly spearheading getting affordable housing, real physical units of affordable housing built in their community. We have a coalition that is a grassroots coalition. We'd love it if you joined. We also will speak to local groups in any town, and that's a great avenue to getting things going in the town. And so, lots of options. I will stop there with the presentation, but happy to answer any questions. I know we've provided lots of information. Hopefully you're not overwhelmed. And yeah, Roger's around for questions too. Yeah. It should be on.
I actually have two questions. What I didn't understand is where public housing and A to A, which may be the same thing, I don't know, fit into what you're talking about and whether Connecticut has any of that. And secondly, I don't understand why a town would limit the expansion of sewer and water. It seems to me that all the other people would want it too. So that's very perplexing to me.
So actually maybe Roger can take that. So in terms of public housing, when I was talking about government-funded subsidized housing, that public housing is an example of that. So the kind of patterns you saw in those maps about where public housing is going, particularly public housing that is open to families with kids, you see the same pattern where it's overwhelmingly located in higher poverty areas that are disproportionately Black and Latino. So, and we have this dynamic with a lot of public and subsidized housing where it's sort of been around for a while and also needs reinvestment. So there's been a little bit of a catch-22, not only in Connecticut, but all around the country of, wow, we have this huge stock of subsidized housing, including public housing, in our cities that needs a lot of help, which was created, through this legacy of intentional segregation. So should we invest our money there, or do we put our money into creating new housing in a way that isn't segregated? And obviously, what we really need is money that can allow us to do both things. Maybe spending, and this is sort of maybe going a little deeper here, but one of the things that I think is really important around fixing up, rehabilitating existing subsidized and public housing is to actually talk with residents about what they want. That hardly ever happens. And when that does happen, what you find is, and very loosely, and where this has already happened, it's usually about 50-50. Half of the residents don't want to leave the neighborhood, they absolutely want to stay there, and half the residents want other options. And so if that is true, you have a real nice opportunity to rehab the housing in a way that is so much better for the residents who want to stay, maybe bring in some mixed income components, so you have some market rate housing too, but then you also need to have the zoning loosened up so you can create that housing in suburban areas that don't have it right now. So that's sort of how public housing fits into it, and there's some really cool things that are going on with public housing, in Kings County out near Seattle. The public housing authorities they're buying units in condos so that they can do it in a scattered site way. There's some of the smaller scale missing middle housing is going on. I mean, there's some great things going on, and I think there's a tendency to want to move away and abandon public housing because people just imagine these skyscraper Cabrini Green versions of public housing, but that's old school. It's not what's happening with public housing anymore. We're moving away from it, but I don't think we can abandon. I don't think we should. And your second question was about sewer. I think, Connecticut, people don't want change, right, at all. And sometimes that's the land of steady habits. And so I think not wanting sewer, I think for some people they don't want sewer actually because they don't want this kind of housing in town. They don't want multifamily housing. Some people don't want it because they don't want anything to change in their town. And I don't know, Roger, if you want to.
Yeah, an example I could have used but didn't use. Can you all hear me okay with the microphone? That better? There we go. So an example from our study, I believe this was the town of, I want to say it was Berlin, but don't quote me on that, where their POCD said explicitly that, Berlin has not extended water and sewer infrastructure into areas beyond the ones where it exists to control development, to ensure that more does not happen. So sometimes it's explicit. We don't want to have things, changing, and we don't want the housing that this could lead to being facilitated. So, yeah.
I live in Windham County, the poorest county.
But we need to give you.
I live in Windham County, which is one of the poorest counties in the state, and I live right next to Willimantic, which has probably more public housing for its size than anywhere else. Next door to Windham, and Willimantic is part of Windham, is Lebanon, Connecticut, and their lots are 2 acres each, it blows my mind every time I think of that. So I was just commenting on that.
Yeah, we should also, I should note, in terms of septic and sewer, we happen to have a special expert here who knows a little bit about that.
Well, that's nerve-wracking. I hope I didn't misspeak then.
No, you were good. Oh, here's the question over here.
I have a question that comes out of your idea that what worked in New Jersey might also work here, and I can see why some elements would, but does New Jersey have more levels of government than Connecticut does? Do they have counties? Do they have regional school districts? There's part of the trouble with Connecticut is towns. It's little. It's all little. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I don't know, my understanding, I'm not touching it because I'm worried I'm going to get feedback. Like, so I should know exactly what the differences are in terms of the levels of government. My understanding is that there's a lot, in terms of zoning, there's a lot, and Roger, you may want to weigh in on this. It's a town-led thing in New Jersey when it comes to zoning itself. I don't know about I can't remember about the school districts. But.
Yeah, so the fair share plans in New Jersey, which are negotiated, it's with individual towns. So you have dozens and dozens and dozens of fair share plans. So it is still, there is that direct analog of being able to come up with a strategy at the town level that nonetheless accounts for regional need. And even though we do lack regional governments, here in Connecticut, there was that piece of 8-2 that I alluded to earlier. We do have built into law some acknowledgement of the need for a regional perspective, notwithstanding the fact that we don't have effective county government. At least ostensibly the need for that perspective, I should say.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about perspective. As far as levels of government, I worked for the State House for a zillion years, as did Percy, and we had 169 towns, and for the last 15 years, we've been trying to combine our towns into health districts, and the pushback has been amazing. But everybody wants their own little fiefdom, and I think that's probably the biggest block here. Huh? It's the land of steady habits.
Connecticut has had individual towns as theocracies in its infancy. Connecticut was founded essentially as 100 and however many theocracies. Each little town was governed by the town elders, literally the church, the congregational church of that particular location, and we retain a lot of that same parochialism, the literal parochialism of, each little town is its own entity and it has its own rules and it will be that way forever and ever, unless we have the collective will to change that at the state level and break some of those boundaries down.
Yes. Completely agree. I know we're hitting up against our hour here. Any legislation proposed for next session? There will be, we hope, fair share planning and zoning legislation proposed. Can you keep us apprised of that? Absolutely. No, we would love to be partnering. If there's interest here, that would be fantastic. Yep. Yeah, so we had, it was actually last session, it was 6611 was the proposed bill. We're revamping it right now to improve it. So we hope to have something in early January that's ready to be shared around again. So, we'll try to share that with you guys, but if you're interested in looking at the earlier version, it's House Bill 6611. Wonderful. All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you.